Welcome, everybody, to the Captain's Coach webinar today that we're putting on for the Capital Rugby Union. I'm very excited to talk to you all and present some information that I feel important through my experiences and research that really presents some valid thoughts in regards to selecting team captains, how you should do that, why you should do that, and how ultimately it will develop the competitive advantage that you're looking for within your program and lead to the type of culture that you want within your team and the impact that they can have to help you craft that culture within your program. And so the way that I'll see this webinar as successful is, number one, if I've challenged some of the assumptions that you have in regards to your approaches to leading your teams. And the second is that I've just presented you one new mental model that you can take away and use for your teams as well. The argument that I will be pushing for essentially today is that a player-led team is more effective than a coach-led team. And all of the information that I'll be presenting really underpins this player-centric model, essentially, in the importance of providing more leadership experiences and mentorship to your program and how to go about that. And that by doing so, that leads your team to reach its full potential. And one thing I want to make sure I articulate is that what I'm not arguing is that I'm not saying coaches do not matter. I think what will happen is as you transition and transform into a player-led team, you as the coach will turn more into an environmental architect, the way that is a way I like to describe it, and we'll talk more about that soon. And I'm certainly not saying that only team captains can or should lead. In fact, it should not be that way within your program. You can have team captains on your team, and also make sure that you communicate and teach them the importance of empowering others within the program as well, because you can't reach your full potential if everybody on the team is not providing the leadership skills that they have to influence the situations that they come into contact with on a daily basis. So what I'd like to start with first is some research that has come across my lap, so to speak, in the last couple of years. And that first one is Sam Walker's book called The Captain's Class. And essentially, Sam Walker was trying to find, over a 10-year period, he did a bunch of research trying to pinpoint who was the greatest teams to exist in the last 100 years. And he put together a certain list of criteria, and he put them into two different tiers. And then from there, what he tried to figure out is, what was it that made these teams the most successful, and did they have any common elements between them? And so I want you to hear it from him first.
What do great teams have in common? What is enduring? What is the secret of enduring?
Okay, so anyone want to guess what the thing that they have in common is? It's got, okay, I'm gonna put it as a great coach.
It's not a coach. I thought talent would be some component. I thought that tactics would play into it. I thought there would be maybe money or resources. But I really thought it would be coaching. I thought there would be something about the coaches of the teams. We're all conditioned to think that coaches have the biggest impact on a team. But what I found was some of these teams had great talent, some of them had mediocre talent. Some of them had great tactics, some had boring tactics. Others had, coaches who were lousy. I mean, had terrible records when they came in, or no experience at all. In fact, some of these teams actually changed coaches in the middle of their streak without incident. So it wasn't that. It was only one thing, and I have to say that what kept me going for 11 years was that I've never seen a more repeatable pattern come out of a giant pile of data. And it was something that not only applied to those 17 teams, but the next 100 teams that were very close. And if you look at the streaks, the beginning and the end of their winning streak, that period of time overlapped precisely, in some cases, in most cases, with the arrival and departure of one player. And in every single case, that player was eventually the leader of the team or the captain of the team, over and over again.
So that was Sam Walker again, and what he essentially said, that within his research, what he found within these great teams was that Um, Over this period of time that they had this high performance, it started when one individual came into the program, um, who was ultimately named the team captain. This high performance began as soon as that individual left. It started to taper off, which is really interesting. He goes on to talk about how every one of these team captains had these 7 characteristics, so to speak, which I will not, I haven't copy and pasted here. I definitely recommend that you go ahead and get the book to read more through it. But a lot of research points to the fact that although somewhat subjective, some really good, at least theory and initial research into this, and what I found to be true within my own experiences with the championship teams that I've been a part of, have all had great team captains and internal leadership in general. But some of the key takeaways that I'll briefly go over is the first being that talent and big budget resources only go so far. Throughout this period of time that he found of this high performance, coaches came and went, strategies, tactics, and resources kind of came and went, or were fluid throughout. But the one consistency was the fact that this great single individual or individual players, 1 or 2, were within that program and helped to lead this team internally to be the best that they can be. The second is that great captains bend the rules and are not worried about being unpopular. A lot of the captains that I work with, this is a struggle for them because a lot of us want to be liked, and we have to be willing to be unpopular. And ultimately, we get respected for that if we can go about those crucial conversations well. The third is that within every one of, in this book, The Captain's Class, these captains that he names are rarely the superstars of the team, but very indispensable support players. The fourth is that great captains serve, and they have a servant leader's heart. They do the grunt work so that they have the right and respect from others to be able to push them to be the best that they can. And the next key takeaway was that, and final one, is that most of these were not interested in being in front of the camera. They were not interested in fame or glory, but they were single-minded in the fact that they wanted to be successful and for the team to win. And here are some quotes on some other coaches, good coaches that are out there who talk about this aspect of internal leadership and the important role that it plays to achieving the outcome that you all are looking for, which is really just to be the best that you can possibly be and win championships consistently. You'll see Greg Popovich and Tom Izzo have both said, a player-led team is more effective than a coach-led team. Urban Meyer here at the bottom talks about how you can get 70% of your wins within a season through talent. You can reach the next level with some discipline, mental toughness, but ultimately you don't get to win championships consistently without great internal leadership happening within the team. And one thing I think it's important to mention, this is not something I would usually insert here because it's something that I talk about separately when it comes to probability in sports. But this is the 3 Ps of winning. And the reason this is in here is because I want to make sure I communicate that I am not arguing for the fact that you can't win championships without, if you don't select team captains, because that's happened previously. There's been great teams with poor coaches that have won championships. There's been teams with great coaches and strong internal leadership with not much talent. There's all sorts of types of teams and qualities and characteristics of teams that have won championships before. But my argument is that selecting team captains and developing leadership within your program gives you the highest probability of winning championships consistently. And one of the reasons for that is the 3 Ps here of winning. And we can only focus and should only focus and can only ultimately determine and have control over the things that we do, which is the process that everyone talks about. And if you have a better process than everybody else, that puts you in the highest puts you in the right position or the best position that you possibly can be in with the highest probability that you will win. And the goal ultimately is to decrease the role that luck plays in our outcome. And that's something that coaches and captains both should be thinking about consistently, because there is this sort of continuum of skill and luck that both play a part in the outcomes that we receive. And so what we want to do is focus on the things that we can control. However, also realize that there are things that we can influence, even though they're not technically in our control. But again, ultimately, with this goal of just doing everything we can, having a process that is much better than everybody else to have the highest probability of winning. And to do that, I think part of that process should be selecting team captains and communicating, having alignment with them, and having the proper expectations so that they can learn and grow to their fullest extent. So next I'd like to do is, in this spirit of probability, I wanted to introduce another, sorry about that. I wanted to introduce another video here by Michael Mauboussin. He has a great book that's called The Success Equation of Untangling Skill and Luck. And just want you to listen to some of the terminology that he uses. He's going to quickly introduce this concept of skill and luck, and I definitely recommend that you watch this video.
Otherwise, I'd still be unemployed. So the topic today is skill and luck. I really want to talk about three things. First, I want to define my terms a bit and talk about what I call the 3 easy lessons. So 3 things you can take away fairly quickly. In the middle part, the meat of the discussion, I would talk about really the complexion of skill and luck, what they look like and how they change over time. And then finally wrap up a bit with what to do about this, but also why we struggle so much in our lives to understand the role of luck. So the simple one way to think about this is thinking about a continuum of activities. On the far left, pure luck, no skills. You might think lotteries or roulette wheels. On the far right, pure skill, no luck. Maybe running races or chess would be over there. Very important to define terms. So let me just take a moment to do that. I'm going to define skill right out of the dictionary, which is the ability to apply one's knowledge readily in execution or performance. So you know how to do something. When you're called on to do it, you can do it on cue. Now, luck, as you might imagine, is much more difficult to define, actually spills into moral philosophy quite quickly. But I'm going to say luck exists when 3 conditions are in place. Number 1, it operates for an individual or organization. So it happens to you or your favorite team or your company. Second is it can be good or bad. And I don't mean to suggest it's symmetrical, because we'll see in a few moments, certainly not symmetrical, but there's a plus sign and a minus sign possible. And third is, it is reasonable to expect a different outcome could have occurred. So if we rewound the tape of time and we played it again, reasonable to expect a different outcome could have occurred. Now, what I've done here for fun is arrayed professional sports leagues based on 1 season of performance. So this is where they actually lie in the luck skill continuum. That's the NBA, Barclays Premier League Soccer, Major League Baseball, the NFL, and then finally the NHL. Now, I'll mention one other thing on luck and skill, which is kind of fun. There's a really interesting test, which I learned from the poker people, about figuring out if there's any skill in an activity, and that is ask if you can lose on purpose. If you can lose on purpose, there must be some skill. If you can't lose on purpose, it's basically all luck.
Again, so that was just some really interesting tidbits of information in regards to the skill and luck continuum, how his research points to the fact that some of these different sports that we play fall within have different levels of skill versus luck that plays a role in our outcome. It's just an interesting concept. I recommend that you watch the video, read the book as well. And I think that this 3 P's of winning and this idea of process and process positioning and performance is something that we'll come back to throughout the rest of this discussion. So the next question that I want to go through, that I get asked quite often, is, should I select team captains? And honestly, it's a very valid question. There are a lot of coaches that have been burned on this particular process of the team captaincy role, where they name team captains and then ultimately is seen as a major failure from the team and ends up being a burden on the team. And so there's just some things that I want to introduce, 4 models in particular that supports 4 mental models in particular that supports why I think selecting team captains are vital. And then we'll talk about how we can develop and make sure that we increase the probability that this goes successfully, right? But I'll start here with this one. There's four: Pareto's principle, the 10-80-10 rule, the bystander effect, then alter casting and role theory. And so the first here is the Pareto's principle, which most of you will know as the 80-20 principle, which is today known as a productivity model, an efficiency model that essentially states that 80% of our outputs stem from 20% of our inputs. And it initially came from this economist, Vilfredo Pareto, who was trying to figure out where all the agricultural produce was coming from in Italy in like the 1600s. And he realized that 80% of the food that was in Italy was coming from 20% of the farms. He went on to do another study and found that in terms of wealth distribution, that in Italy at the time, 80% of the wealth came from 20% of the people, or 20% of the people held that wealth. And so we see this in almost everything that we do. It's a great mental model. It really puts an emphasis on focusing on the things that matter, that 20%. And so, excuse me. So why this is important here for this in this context for team captains is that regardless if you select team captains or not, it's important that you realize that 80% of the influence that's occurring within your program is coming from 20% of the individuals on the team. And at the very least, it's important that you identify who they are, because from my perspective, a coach only has so many resources at his disposal, especially in particular time, to really do leadership development well. That takes one-on-one time. It takes mentorship. It takes feedback. It's very intentional. And you just don't have that type of time for everybody, depending on what kind of resources you have. I'm not quite sure, but for a majority of teams, that's not the case. You usually have a coach and maybe a couple, if any, assistant coaches, especially at the club level. So the first one, 80-20, 80% of the influence coming from 20% of the people on your team. The second here is this 10-80-10 principle, which is also a organizational psychology term as well. And essentially what this states is that within any team, any organization, that you have your top 10%, which are your elite performers, the nucleus of the group, the individuals that are constantly performing and bought in completely to the vision and the program and what it is that you're trying to do and accomplish. Then there's the 80% that is the status quo and the standard, and most of these individuals are just going with the flow. They're there to get out of it what they want to get out of it, essentially. And then the bottom 10% are your slackers and malcontents. And these are the ones that just aren't bought in, and usually your problem children. And why this model is important is because every single day there is a war happening between the top 10% and the bottom 10% of for the 80%. And so your team will not be the best that it can be if your top 10% cannot influence that 80% into their realm, so to speak. If they can't bring them up to their standards and to new standards, and if the bottom 10% win where they bring the rest of the 80% down with them, you're not going to, the likelihood and probability that you win decreases. And so again, it comes back to this idea of resources. We want to pour into the individuals that have the most influence within our team so that they can win this battle and ultimately help everybody else get to help the team get to the type of culture and behaviors that are expected for high performance. The third is the bystander effect. And so this is a social psychological theory that says that people are less likely to step in to mediate a situation when there are others around. And we see this quite frequently within a lot of sports teams where an athlete will walk past a standard that is not acceptable. And the reason this matters is because your culture is what you allow within your program. Your culture is what you allow. And so any standards of behavior that you pass over and do not hold others accountable for is your culture. And so selecting team captains ultimately provides this final responsibility on at least one or two individuals that holds them responsible for making sure that somebody on the team is not bypassing these these behaviors that should be unacceptable within the program. And ultimately that will help to push this acceptable behavior of crucial conversations and holding each other accountable. That can start to be a cultural norm. And that's what we want to push for. And so the fourth here is a newer model that I've come across recently that actually stemmed from Dr. Anthony Pratt-Canis. And what he said to me, and he's a deception expert, one of the foremost experts in deception. And he said that ultracasting is this way of persuading individuals by projecting an identity or role onto them to fulfill. And we see this in role theory too, is that we act out these socially defined roles that influence the things that we do. And I think that this really stems down to, like, do titles matter? Because ultimately the team captaincy role is just a title that is bestowed upon somebody who is highly influential within your team. And we have found that titles provided to people do change or can change their behaviors. Ultimately, we want to craft the nature of that role, this team captaincy role, make sure that there is alignment there, that they have expectations and understand what is expected of them as the team captain. And by doing so, you help them to enact behaviors that are helpful to develop the culture that you are looking for and envisioning within your team. And at this point in time, we were going to do an exercise and break into groups. I don't think we have much time to do that now, but the question that I always ask the coaches and captains that I work with is, what is the purpose of sports? I've heard multiple different answers that have been really good. I've heard that it's about developing character and virtues within the individuals that play, so that ultimately they can go into life as better people. I've heard that it's about winning. I've heard that it's about camaraderie and connection. We're providing experiences for memories, and the memories of working, of understanding how to work together. These are all great aspects of sport. If you have multiple answers, I continue to go even further. I ask those individuals to prioritize or rank what is most important out of all of those multiple ones that you provided to me. And I think that this question is the first step in regards to how you can transform into a player-led organization. And I'll give you an example. Especially at the high school and college level, I see the purpose of sports as being a way, an experience, the perfect incubator for leadership development, and ultimately to develop characteristics and character and virtues that help, that will help you be a better individual, better father, husband, wife, mother, servant, worker, manager in the real world. And so if I see that as being the ultimate purpose for sports, then that's going to change the resources that I provide to certain areas, certain trainings. And so I think it's an interesting question that I always pose that helps you to reorient yourself and the resources at your disposal and push them to the things that really matter. One of the other things we were going to do is go through each one of these quotes, talk through if you agreed or disagreed. And these are quotes from coaches that do not select team captains, who I personally have a high regard for and are well known within the sports community as being really strong coaches. The first is Mike Leach, who's a little wild, but he's been burned by captains quite a bit. And one of the things he says, I don't want anyone feeling as if they are special or that they are above others. And I think that's more than fair. If you've been burned on that, it sounds like he's been, but I have quite a few arguments there. A couple of them on top of my head here are that if the purpose is to make individuals the best individuals that they can be, and help them to go through this individuation process, so to speak, they have to understand what leadership is, right? And right off the bat, if you have athletes within your program who don't understand that leadership is about serving, and that title just means more responsibility to serve and to put yourself below everybody else, then you have failed them as a program, because ultimately they're going to go into managerial roles. They're going to be fathers or wives, and ultimately they're going to be bestowed titles. And they need to understand that that just because you're provided that title does not mean that you should be given more, that you should feel that you are, above others. And I think that that's a very important principle to understand and learn. And I don't think that, and again, if it goes back to the purpose of sports for me, I think that what we're trying to do is provide them experiences so that they can learn and grow, so they can be successful in life. And again, I think it comes back to, if you don't do that and you don't teach them such an obvious lesson, then or allow them to go through an experience to learn an obvious lesson of that nature, and provide them feedback and communicate with them to help them along this journey of the team captaincy role and leadership, you're really failing them. The second is Brad Stevens. Jack Clark also had a similar comment. He talked about hijack, how he feels like leadership has been hijacked. And I disagree in the sense that if anybody's hijacked leadership, it's been the coaches. And that it's something that a lot of people are starting to understand, that what we want to do is provide more experiences for leadership and for the coaches to become more hands-off and do more mentorship and asking questions and give sports back to the athletes so that they can go through this developmental experience. But Brad Stevens here mentioned specifically that he wants everybody to be leaders on his team, and that he wants everyone to add leadership within their own authentic way. And I do not think that these two things of selecting team captains and allowing other people to lead too is mutually exclusive. You can have both. In fact, you should. That'd be like saying me as a manager in my work should be the only one exerting influence or leading. That should not be the case. I should be trying to empower the individuals that work under me, so to speak, or that don't have this title, so that they can have more buy-in, so that they can develop more effectively. And so this is not something I think should, again, I've said it should not be mutually exclusive. It can be both. I do agree that everybody is a leader in the fact that we all have certain skill sets that we use to influence other people, that we all have this capability to lead, and that it's really a choice, and that we want everybody on the team to lead. And so we're going back to this 80-20 principle. If you're only at your 80% level, that's certainly not in any way high performing. So although team captains or your main influencers exert 80% of the influence, that other 20% matters quite a bit. And that's actually the hardest number to get many times, is to get that final 20% and to get to 100. And so we want everybody to lead. We just think that team captains, coaches have limited resources and should be developing particular individuals with the most influence. Ultimately, though, to make sure that these other individuals on the team are more empowered to speak up and do and lead and enact behaviors that are helping our culture. The third quote says that I do not want anyone to feel slighted and thus provide less effort than they should in the leadership role that they can play. And I think that this comes back to an issue with this. It sounds like this coach has had this experience before, and a lot of coaches, I personally have been a part of a process where this happened. And ultimately, these athletes need to understand that they need to do what's best for the team. That should be the main thing that they're doing. And if they're not worried about that, that's not something they're focused on, then you're going to have this problem come up at some point in time later on anyways. And I also think, again, going back to the purpose of sport, there's many times in our lives that we're going to be passed up and passed over and looked over. And we have to learn how to go about that negative experience effectively. And so I'd rather that occur earlier than later. And again, a lot of these issues that these coaches are bringing up really can be solved with some honest communication and some feedback. Like if you know somebody, if you have 20 people on your team and there's 10 of them that could honestly be named team captain and do a great job, and you only select 2 or 3, you just need to sit down and have an honest conversation with those other however many people it was and say, hey, I think that you have this awesome potential too. We ended up going with this individual for this reason. And just have a conversation with them. Usually the reason that this comes into play is because that conversation is not had. And that's where people feel slighted and disrespected. And the final quote is about this idea of giving titles makes them act differently, and that it takes the good qualities that they had in the first place. And this comes back to the similar response I would have for the first quote, which is, I'd rather them learn that now than later. And a lot can be improved with some feedback, some one-on-one mentorship. And then this kind of drives me to another idea as well, which is that a lot of people that are given this title of team captaincy seem to go over and above what other people see as who they were, or they'll say like, man, you've really changed. And I'm not even quite sure what that means, because I do understand where they're coming from, but growth doesn't happen without change. And so I do see an issue when individuals go overboard potentially, but I think that is, again, you have to have a growth mindset. Realize that a lot of these athletes, especially at the high school and college level, have never been in a legit leadership position that matters to them, that has real impact for them and the people that they're leading. And so with that, it's going to come some failure. And I think that you just need to make sure that within your process, you are meeting with them consistently. You're hearing from the other players as well. And you're providing them feedback and asking questions about some of the actions that they're taking as team captain. And so I realized that this idea of leadership we've been talking about, many times very intangible in many ways. A lot of people define it in different ways. It's certainly something that should have been presented at the beginning, something that you have to talk about to make sure we're on the same, the correct terminology here going forward in a discussion of this nature. And so what I'd love for you to do in the chat box is if you could define leadership in your own words through the chat, and we'll take a look at that later. But one of the issues that I see here is that when I go into a program is that the coach and the captain, they have different definitions for this word. And the reason that matters is because, number one, it means that they probably never talked about it before, really. And what really matters is that they have different expectations. If you have a different definition of a word, you're going to have different expectations on how it's played out. And that is what really matters, because that means there's not alignment. And so this word leadership, a lot of people have different definitions for it. I think that a good standard is the ability to influence and inspire others to come together to achieve a common goal. But more specifically, the best way I've heard it described, and the way that I like to describe it best, because it provides a new perspective on this, and something that's much more tangible, is this idea that leadership is equal to influence. John Maxwell said, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. I think that's a great, simple way that, again, is much more tangible. And it's more tangible because influence is this ability to have the effect on a character development or behavior. And we know a lot about behavioral psychology. And there's a lot that backs that up, that we can learn about individuals and human behavior. And behavior matters because that's the process. When we talk about having the best process, that is essentially the things that you can control, the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and which are behaviors, right? And those behaviors, certain behaviors, lead to an increased probability of success in your results. So one other thing here that I think is an awesome framework when it comes to thinking about influence is Joseph Grenny's work on the 6 sources of influence. And when it comes to the team captaincy role, I think this framework's really good visual to show the power that it has when we think about internal leadership, because the social aspect of influence is massive. Right here, there's 6 boxes. This is holding 2 of those boxes. So a third of the influence essentially is coming from people within the team. And it's only saying it's a third. I would argue that it's even more, potentially up to 50%. And maybe even more than that. But it's this idea that the team captains, the roles that they play they're in a sense, they're harnessing peer pressure. They're leveraging this social influence capacity to make sure that the culture that you want, the behaviors that you want that are going to lead you to success are maintained and people are held accountable for that. And I mentioned at the beginning how I think when we're trying to transform a program to be more player-led, that coach has got to move more to to becoming an environmental architect. And that's important because this idea of structural sources of influence, this is where the coach really reigns supreme. It's the way that they design rewards, how they hold others accountable, the type of cues that are around them. Environment is huge, and we'll talk about environment more in a minute. But and as you can see, there's 3 rows here. There's the social and structural, which we've talked about, and then there's the individual and personal aspects for their motivation or even abilities that influence people into certain behaviors too. So just a great framework that I think you should look into. Again, it's by Joseph Grenny. He's got a great video out there called Mastering the Skill of Influence. And a great way and a quick story to provide is this Halloween story that he actually talks about in his video, which I really like. And that is that there was this scientist on Halloween night wanted to put together a little scientific experiment. He goes outside to his front porch on Halloween night and puts out a bowl of apples, sliced apples, and a bowl of candy next to each other. Turns the light on, goes back inside, writes down who picks what over the course of the first half of the night, and figures out, there was only 5% of people picked the bowl of apples, the sliced apples, of the kids that came up. And at the start of the second half, he goes outside, and all he does is he puts a poster on the door with a picture of Batman biting into an apple, and underneath of it saying, "What would Batman do?" Goes back inside and starts writing down who takes what. And at the end of that, he ends up writing down that 45% of the kids pick the apples over the candy. So it's a really interesting and cool story that provides you some insight into like the power of the environment and the power of thinking differently, maybe to exert influence on the behaviors that are happening within your team. And that's just one source. That would be like an environmental cue that changes to change the behavior within your team. So influence is powerful, and that's really what, when as a PSYOP officer, that's what we're looking at doing, is finding different ways to influence behaviors. And then one more note about influence and leadership that I liked was Coach Jack Clark, who's won 26 national championships, talked about this idea of leadership being a tool belt. And I like that picture, and that each one of these tools are skill sets that you have. It could be your ability to communicate well, your competency and skill set within the sport itself, your knowledge of the game, your ability of courage to have crucial conversations. All of these are skills that at some point in time, as a tool, we pull out to influence a situation. And our goal as coaches is to help our athletes develop more tools at their disposal, so that they can influence the situations they come into effectively. And then if you're talking about team captains, you have to talk about team culture. And so quickly, just to make sure we're on the same page as to what culture is, culture is, like we've talked about, culture is what you allow. The standards that you walk past are the standards that you accept. You can see the quote here at the bottom. And culture is really these shared assumptions that drive the things that we value, that ultimately drives all of the things that we see. And specifically, I've talked about this before, it drives behavior, which is your process. And ultimately, culture is the power to shape reality. That's how powerful it is. because it shapes everything that we see. And you see here, this is Edgar Schein's model of culture. And then I mentioned you have the underlying assumptions that should really be at the bottom, which drive the values, which drive all of the things that we see, and which is reality. So it's a really interesting way to think about the importance of culture, how it's focused a lot on of times that behaviors are the measure of your culture. And that leads me to question many coaches when they think about, how are they measuring culture? They aren't. I've yet to come across somebody that has a good way to measure their culture. Usually, a coach comes in, they talk about, how they're going to change the culture, and then they correlate that to the amount of winning that they're doing. There's not always that there is a correlation that's there. But a lot of times this aspect of narrative fallacy comes into play, and it's really not the case. We're not measuring that well. So I have some thoughts about the way that coaches can and should measure culture by specific vital behaviors that they articulate and are able to observe and measure in that sense. So maybe that would be another discussion for future time. But again, culture vital to the success of a team and increasing the probability that you win consistently, in the team captaincy role being a driving force behind the social influence of what behaviors are acceptable. And this is a model that I love personally, that we use a lot within our detachment and company that I'm with. And that's understand that all behavior serves a purpose. And this Levin's equation states that behavior is a function of a person in their environment. And it's just a great framework that provides you some insights as to how powerful and the environment is in regards to helping people exert behaviors that you want. And finally, for this section of the discussion here, when it comes to leadership itself, it's important to think through the question of nature or nurture. And do you think great leaders are born, or are they made? And usually there's most people I've heard are somewhere in the middle. There's some sort of a percentage. And so we're going to send a poll out, and I want you to write down what you think, if it's 0 to 10% nature, 10 to 30%, and then all the way up that I think we have. And let us know what you think the percentages between nature and nurture when it comes to this aspect of how great leaders come to be. Because this question is an underlying assumption that is driving your thoughts about how to develop leaders. If you think it's all nature, then you have no reason to even put together any type of leadership development program. And that might be fine. However, I think that since it's not something we can really know at this point, a better story and belief to have is that it's all nurture. And if you take if you believe that, then that's going to drive you to a certain process that will ultimately provide more skill sets and more experiences. Because that means that your role as the coach is to provide experiences, provide teachings to help them develop these skills. That ultimately is just what leadership is, as we talked about the leadership tool belt, in my opinion. So the next question here is, how do you select team captains? If you think that you should, how do I go about it? I've heard of people having the athletes vote. I've heard of having just a coaching staff vote. I've heard of a mixture of the two. I've heard of teams creating job postings and having them apply at the beginning of the year. I've heard of weekly team captains. So there's a lot of different ways to go about that. I think the best way is to have the athletes vote, but have the coaches have the ultimate say. And so you might see that as being superficial, especially for the athletes, and not really accurate. But that process of having them vote allows you to see where their thoughts are as a team, as to who they see as the most respectful, who they most respect, I should say, and who they would like them to lead. And so one of the most important things is that this can oftentimes become a popularity contest. And so it's vital that you spend the time to get your team to understand the importance of this team captaincy role. Make sure they understand what is expected of the team captain. And I would present some of the things I've mentioned previously about, how the captains in this reminder section I have here is like, they're not always the best player of the team. You don't have to pick the best player. It's the individual that you think is relentless, that's going to serve with a full heart every single day. And there's going to be other characteristics that you feel like should fit too, but you want to communicate your expectations to them. And hopefully that helps them in their selection of the right individuals. And then, but ultimately, I think the coach should have the final say. But again, a lot of options there. One of the questions that I've been thinking through that is an interesting question is that many times on teams, the most influential player is not always the one with the highest character. And so do you pick the most influential and try to develop their character, or do you pick the person with the highest character or try to develop their influence? Great question to ask. Anybody that's interested in my thoughts on that, just send me an email or chat me and I'll follow up later. And always thinking about who is part of the 80%. I think that's an important aspect too of the exertion of influence on your team. And so the next section here we have is the roles and responsibilities that I think are important for captains to think through and a way for them to focus their energies. And the first is that they should be thinking about every day when they go to practice, even outside of practice, how am I winning over the 80%? That war is raging between the top 10% and the bottom 80%. And that top 10%, those captains, they have to win. And so how can they win that 80%? Think through that. The second one is they have to understand that they have to hold people accountable and be a culture reinforcer. The third is having self-awareness. You have to understand who you are because a team is a reflection of its leadership. And so your weaknesses many times get promoted within the team. The next one is modeling the way. That's pretty obvious for most. You can't talk the talk and not walk the walk. Always serve and always find ways in which you can do the grunt work and serve your team. A lot of times that's unfortunately just having the courage to have crucial conversations with your friends. And then the next two are interesting. I think that when I think about team captains and yelling at players, especially in regards to performance, I think it's useless in many cases and kind of hurts things. So if like most players that come onto the field and miss a shot or drop a ball, that's not something they wanted to do. And so really what you should do a majority of the time is just encourage your teammates to be better. Just encourage them. And, a pat on the back goes a long way, say it's okay. But there are three things I think in particular you should really get on people for. The first is and these are the things that they can control, right? So the first is intensity. I call it the if method. Intensity, if you feel like they're not providing intensity, then you need to get on them about that. The second is if you feel they're lacking focus for that day or for that game, get on them. And the third is if you see that there's some form that is pretty obvious that they're messing up on, usually that's the coach's job. But if it's obvious, just coach them up, make sure you provide them some cues. Don't give them a 20-minute long speech on how to shoot a ball in the middle of the game, right? You just say, hey, remember, keep your elbow in, or remember, make sure that you follow through. Just simple cues that you can use. That goes a long way. And I know that those are very broad, generic. We have put together an app that provides you hundreds of different actions that you can take. And we have this algorithm that we have that puts it into 16 different steps you can do on a daily basis based off of the information you provided at the beginning when you signed up. A lot of captains that I come across are asking the question, like, what specifically can I do to increase my influence? And so this is one way that we found to be useful for those athletes that are interested. And so if you are, please reach out to us. And there are, again, I've got hundreds of different steps that you can take, specific actions you can take to be more influential and serve your team to its fullest extent that are more specific. And then when it comes to roles and responsibilities, I think these are just two models I think are useful to communicate. And on the left here, we've already talked about it a little bit when we think about the process and how that gives us the highest probability for success. And so in that sense, you know, the behaviors are the things that we have control over. And in that sense, all you're trying to do is have a better process than everybody else. And that's a choice. I mean, actually executing and taking action and having this process of certain behaviors separates yourself from everybody else. And that process allows you to win. And so ultimately that process is a choice. And so I think this law of separation is important for you to understand. A lot of team captains say, you know, everybody wants to win. Every time I ask that question, everybody raises their hand. So it's not a matter of wanting to win. It's actually taking the actions that it requires daily, which our app kind of helps with, to know what those actions might be, which is what separates you, especially over time. There's this compounding effect. And then the next one is that the team is a reflection of you as the team captain and as the coach, really. And you'll see that your weaknesses are portrayed and magnified within the rest of the team because you're exerting most of the influence, you know, if you've selected the right team captain. And, you know, I know in my personal experience, I've seen that as somebody who's struggled to finish strong. A couple of teams that I've been on also held that similar characteristic, which was unfortunate. And so as we finish up here, we move into, you know, we talked about, should you decide, how can you decide what are the roles and responsibilities for a team captain? And ultimately as a coach, how can you provide a systematic development within your program? And what does that look like? And some quick issues here that I just want to touch on. You know, businesses have been, in the commercial side, have been doing leadership development for some time now, and it's really, for the most part, shown to be ineffective. And most of that's because it's all lecture-based. Most of the leadership development that we go through is lecture-based, and that's not a transforming experience. It's not an experience, and experiences are how we grow. It's how we learn. Lecture-based is useful for general awareness of topics, discussion. It can be useful as a culture reinforcer in regards to nomenclature and terminology and lexicon. But this lecture is just not how we learn. And so I would tell you that the more lecture you do, the worse your leadership development process is going to be. And the other issue we see on the commercial side too is that what happens is we take leaders outside of their environment. We put them in a classroom, we ask them these questions that everybody knows the answers to. Everybody knows the classroom answer for most of these questions. And then once they go back into the environment though, the same behaviors are enacted because that environment is crucial in terms and in regards to our development, and something that you should take into consideration. But what's great about sports is that it is the perfect incubator, I think, for leadership development. That really follows, and what you should do is follow the 70-20-10 method that says that when we're trying to learn anything, you want to spend 70% of your training time just doing it, 20% of feedback on that task, and then 10% of some lecture to provide some information that they can use and apply when they go back into that experience. And so what we do when we approach this concept is, first, we do educate, but we realize that they don't learn anything through that education for the most part. All it does is it provides some awareness of certain, what I like to say is mental models. And we're trying to push this functionality of presenting and providing mental models for athletes, because those are what they can use when they have a collection and lattice work of frameworks and mental models to make the right decisions in a certain situation. But ultimately, we start with some lecture-based material, but very short, concerted amount of time with that. And then we mentor them, one-on-one mentorship, and we ask them a lot of questions. It's not lecture-based. It's, you know, how did you feel about that? What happened here? Where do you think you can be better? And we just mentor them and try to insert these mental models into the experiences that they're going through, and as they're reflecting on them. And then finally, is this idea of, if you want leaders within your program, you have to give them opportunities to lead. You have to. And this idea of that experience is ultimately is what leads to development. And then you can mentor through them and reflect on those experiences later. But a majority of your leadership development needs to be of them doing something, whether it's leading a meeting, leading a practice, teaching certain aspects of the game to the team. There's all sorts of ways that and experiences that we've found through our podcasts and different avenues of how somebody can develop more skills in this leadership competency. And this next one is, a lot of people have been burned on this team captaincy issue. And so I think there are three main reasons for that. Usually one of the first reasons is that you just selected the wrong person at the wrong time. A lot of times people just select the best player, and that's not always the right way to go about it. The second is that you failed to develop them properly. And so 90% of the time what happens is that, especially if you think of, let's just say high school, you have a freshman that comes and is playing JV, freshman, sophomore, and then comes on to the varsity team their junior year. Senior years, maybe their junior year, they had a good year. Their senior year, they come, they talk to the coach their senior year, and they're named and selected the team captain. But up to that point, they had never once had a discussion about it. That had never really even been modeled to them effectively. And so, the issue we see there is that these athletes are given this role. They want to do well because they want to win, but they've never been developed. It's never been communicated to them. There's never been any expectations given. And that goes to the third point here, which is that coaches don't take the time to provide feedback to them on how they're doing as a team captain. And so this process just really needs to be improved, in my opinion, ultimately because we're trying to develop these individuals to give them skill sets that are going to help them succeed in life. And the final slide I have here is that the 5 steps, if you want to transform into a player-led team, the first is to, as I've mentioned previously, is to have clarity of purpose and understand what it is that you're doing and why it matters. Hopefully that reorients you to putting the resources to where it is that you want to push them to. The second is defining leadership and making sure that everybody within your program knows what leadership is, knows what it looks like to a certain extent, understand that it's all about this idea of influence behavior, make sure the program has alignment and expectations, roles, responsibilities for this, so that there's some framework that these players can move into to help them be most successful. Because ultimately, you as the coach need to have extreme ownership about who your players are in your program, the type of character that they have. Because regardless of the range of character types that you have within your team, there are ways to influence them to be better, and so you need to take ownership of that. The third step to transform is really to cultivate this idea of growth mindset, because a lot of these athletes, these young men, young women, have never really been into a leadership position that they cared about, that had real meaning and impact, and where they can affect real change that matters to them. And so with that's going to be some failure, and you need to allow for that failure to occur, and just need to consistently realize that as long as they're failing, but you're providing feedback and there's improvement that's there, then that's what you're looking for. And so I think a growth mindset is good within the team. I get a lot of coaches and other athletes on the team that say, our captain's doing a really bad job of doing X, Y, Z. And, it's a bad situation, but the coaches aren't having honest conversations with them about that. And I just think that conversation that says, hey, like, this is an individual on our team who we really respect. And if you feel like he's not doing a great job, realize that, this is part of that process. Like, this is a time for him or her to really work through difficult, maybe theoretical discussions or crucial conversations, all sorts of different things. So I just think having a growth mindset on this leadership front is important. And ultimately, growth doesn't happen without some change, and that your team should expect that there are some changes that happen within this individual, because we're looking for that individual through this experience and for the whole team as a whole to transform into almost a new being, so to speak, and to have new skill sets and new thoughts, new beliefs, new behaviors. All of that is important. The fourth is selecting and identifying the right team captains. That's really a difficult thing to do sometimes. And so if you're going to transform to a player-led team, you have to, part of that transition process is doing this accurately and appropriately. And then the final one is just developing leaders systematically and providing these athletes experiences, moving yourself back from having your fingers in everything, and just becoming a puppeteer, so to speak, and really thinking about the environment that you're creating for your athletes. And ultimately, at the very least, making sure that you're providing some feedback and mentorship to them on a consistent basis. And so that's all I had. A lot of information there, but definitely am excited to go into this Q&A and listen and hear some of your feedback on these topics and get your own personal experiences that you've had here, and maybe how some of these aspects that I have again in this presentation could be improved. But definitely hope that you enjoyed it. And I think now, Matt, I think we're going to go into the Q&A. So I'm ready whenever you are.